Every species that reaches the stars eventually learns one rule before anything else, before faster than light, travel before terraforming, before diplomacy or trade or alliances. They learn it the same way children learn not to touch fire by watching something else get burned. The rule is simple: do not wake the humans. I learned it on my first day at the Galactic Patrol Academy, recited from a data slate by an instructor who looked like he had personally watched empires collapse. He did not explain it, he did not discuss it, he stated it, moved on, and left the silence to do the teach. I was 18 years old in human terms, freshly posted from the Aran colonies, and I thought the silence was dramatic posturing. I thought a lot of things back then that turned out to be wrong. My name is Voss Aran. I hold the rank of intelligence cadet 3rd tier, assigned to sector monitoring post 11 on the edge of the quarantine perimeter. My post is not glamorous. There are no battles here, no diplomatic summits, no moments worth recording in the official archives. I sit at a monitoring console 9 hours shift, watching a ring of interdiction. Buoys blink green against the dark, and I file reports that no one reads about, a species that no one talks about, above a planet that no one visits. The planet is called Earth, the species is called human, and for 400 years the rule has held. I have been stationed at post 11 for 7 months when I noticed the first anomaly. It was minor, a single buoy, designation E771, blinked amber instead of green during a routine status cycle. Amber means the unit is running a self-diagnostic. It is not an alarm, it is not even a warning. Every monitoring officer in the patrol has seen amber lights, and every monitoring officer in the patrol has logged them, noted they timestamp, waited for the green to return, and gone back to their work. I logged it, I noted the timestamp. I waited, the green did not return. E7714 went dark instead, not amber, not green. Dark, a full signal dropout which I had never seen in 7 months of watching, which the station logs showed had never happened in the 93 years this particular post had been staffed. I filed an alert, marked it high priority, and calmed my supervisor, Lieutenant Delarin. Drillerin told me to recheck my calibration and go back to watching. I rechecked my calibration. Everything was fine. I went back to watching. 40 minutes later, E779 went dark, then E7724, then E7731. Each one 5 units apart, each one dropping offline in a clean sequence, moving east to west along the north band of the perimeter like someone flipping switches on a circuit board. They had already memorized. I stopped filing standard alerts. I opened a priority channel directly to command. No one answered for 11 minutes. When someone finally answered, it was an adjutant with the flat voice of a person who handles too many calls and believes in none of them. I told her what I was seeing. I described the sequence. I told her the gaps between each dropout were exactly equal, 41 minutes 30 seconds, repeating without variation. She told me to document everything and expect a response within the standard review window of 72 hours. 70 stared at my console. Another boy winked out. E7736. 41 minutes and 30 seconds after the last one, almost to the second, I sat back in my chair and did a calculation I did not particularly want to do at the current Rate the entire northern band of the perimeter would be dark in less than 4 days, and the thing that made my hands go cold on the console was not the dropouts themselves. Boys failed. Equipment degraded. Those things happened. The thing that made my hands go cold was the sequence, the perfect mathematical patient sequence, because equipment degradation was random. Cascading failure was chaotic, scheduled. Deactivation was not. Someone out there was doing this on purpose. And whoever they were, they already knew exactly where every buoy was. I pulled the buoy placement archives. The full grid had last been publicly documented in the Galactic Patrol Engineering Registry 412. Years ago, when the quarantine was first established, it had been updated twice since, both times under full security classification, both times accessible only to Patrol Engineering Command and the 3 senior members of the Conclave's Quarantine Oversight Board. The current placement grid was not something a random salvager or a curious deep space surveyor could stumble across. It was not something you could find in open databases or reconstruct from gravitational readings without decades of work and extremely specialized equipment. Whoever was taking down those buoys was not stumbling. I pulled signal logs for the dead zones around the missing units. Static, mostly the expected background radiation of empty space, but in the data noise something kept surfacing. Not a signal exactly, more like the negative shape of one small electromagnetic disturbances consistent with a vessel operating under a very good stealth protocol. Not perfect. Nothing was perfect, but good enough that if I had not been looking for it specifically, I would have dismissed it as interference from a passing rock. I was looking for it specifically. Now I triangulated the disturbances. Whatever was out there was moving slowly, methodically, pausing near each dead buoy for approximately 20 minutes before moving on. Not long enough to analyze a buoy in detail if you were doing it the first time, long enough to retrieve something you had already analyzed before and were now collecting. I pulled the historical anomaly logs for the northern perimeter going back 100 years. It took me 40 minutes to find what I was looking for, but it was there, buried in a decade-old routine report filed by a night shift officer named Paul Aaron, who had noted with mild interest and no follow-up an electromagnetic disturbance in this same sector that lasted 3 days and then disappeared. 100 years ago, someone had been out here before. Someone had visited these buoys before, taken readings, mapped the grid in detail, and gone home. And now they were back to collect the units themselves. Collect, not destroy. That distinction took on weight as I sat with it. If someone wanted to bring down the perimeter as an act of aggression, they would disable the buoys, not retrieve them. You did not risk moving slowly through a monitored zone, stopping at each unit, spending 20 careful minutes at each one. If your goal was sabotage, sabotage was fast. This was something else. This was study. I thought about the rule, do not wake the humans. I looked at the dark spots spreading across my display. I thought, what if the humans were already awake? The thought felt like stepping off a ledge. I tried to set it aside. I filed another priority alert, this one marked urgent, and attached everything I had: the sequence, the timing, the historical anomaly, the movement triangulations. I sent it to command, to patrol intelligence headquarters and to the quarantine oversight board. Then I made myself a hot drink from the station synthesizer, sat back down at my console and watched the next buoy go dark exactly on schedule, 41 minutes and 30 seconds. Whoever was out there was patient. Whoever was out there had been patient for a very long time, and whoever was out there was extremely good at what they were doing. I had been trained to monitor. I had been trained to report. I had not been trained for this specific flavor of dread that was spreading through me as I watched the sequence continue perfectly, unhurriedly across my display. The dread that came not from seeing something dangerous, but from recognizing in the careful precision of those intervals a kind of intelligence, organized, purposeful, completely aware of itself, completely aware. I suspected of me. That thought arrived like a cold hand on the back of my neck. I turned around. The room was empty, of course. Monitoring post 11 had a crew of 4: me, Drellerin, a technician named Vess, and an automated maintenance unit that spent most of its time in the crawl space behind the power regulators. But the emptiness of the room did not make the feeling go away. I turned back to my console, stared at the display, counted the dark spaces. Northern perimeter was 30% gone. I opened the signal analysis interface and started running deep scans on the dead zones, looking for anything beyond the stealth vessel's electromagnetic shadow. It was time-consuming work, the kind that required manual review of each data layer rather than automated flagging. I was 3 layers in when I found it. Not electromagnetic disturbance, not the wake of a propulsion system, a signal. Narrowband, compressed clearly. Deliberate, aimed directly at my station, not broadcast, aimed like someone had looked up the position of post 11 on a map and pointed a transmitter at it. The encoding was not in any patrol standard, but the underlying structure was not entirely foreign either. It was built from simple, repeating mathematical patterns, the kind of universal opening that every first contact protocol began with, the kind designed to say across any language barrier, this is not noise, this is language, we know you can hear us. And then after the mathematical preamble, the signal resolved into something I could actually read, because whoever had sent it had also included attached like a key, a partial translation matrix built from fragments of 3 known patrol communication standards. They had reverse engineered enough of our language structure to say something intelligible. I parsed it with shaking hands. Is anyone out there? We have been trying to reach you for 200 years. I sat very still for a long moment outside my station in the dark. The next buoy on the northern perimeter quietly went offline, 41 minutes and 30 seconds. Exactly on schedule. I looked at the message on my screen. I looked at my console. I thought about the rule. I thought they were never asleep, and I realized somewhere in the cold, clear, clarifying way that genuinely important realizations arrive, that every assumption the patrol had built this posting on, every assumption the conclave had built the quarantine on, might have been wrong from the very beginning. Not wrong in the way that small mistakes were wrong, correctable with a memo and an updated protocol. Wrong in the way that foundational things were wrong when the people who built them were afraid of the answer. I did not respond to the signal, not yet. I sat in the quiet of my station above a Planet no one was supposed to notice. Watching the northern perimeter go dark, piece by piece, and I started to understand that the real question was never whether the humans would wake up. The real question was what we were going to do now that they had. I did not sleep that night. I do not mean that in the dramatic sense of lying awake staring at the ceiling, though there was some of that. I mean that I physically did not enter my bunk, because every time I stepped away from my console, I felt the particular anxiety of someone who has seen something important and is terrified of missing what comes next. I kept the signal open on one display and the buoy grid on another, watching both simultaneously. Waiting, the buoys kept going dark. The signal did not repeat. By the time Dr. Rand arrived for the morning shift, 22 units in the northern band were offline. He stood in the doorway of the monitoring room for a long moment, looking at my display, and did not say anything. Drillerin was not a man given to visible reaction. He was a career patrol officer in his fourth decade of service, compact and methodical, with the quiet manner of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that most things in the universe were not worth panicking about. He walked to my console, leaned over my shoulder, and studied the display for 90 seconds. When did this start? He asked. 1900 hours yesterday, and commands. Response 72-hour review window. He straightened up, said nothing for a moment, then show me the signal. I showed him the signal. He read it twice. He pulled up the triangulation data, the historical anomaly from a century ago, the electromagnetic movement pattern of the stealth vessel. He went through all of it carefully and methodically, the way he did everything, and when he was done, he sat down in his own chair and looked at the wall for a while. How long have you been awake? He asked. All night. Go sleep for 4 hours. I am going to escalate this past the standard review channel. That was the most alarming thing he had said so far. Daron had worked under the standard review channel for his entire career and had never, to my knowledge, gone around it. The fact that he was willing to do so now told me that he had looked at the same data I had and reached the same conclusion. This was not a buoy malfunction. This was not equipment degradation. This was a first contact scenario, or something extremely close to one, unfolding in real time against a quarantine perimeter, and the 72-hour review window was not built for that. I went to my bunk. I did not sleep. After 40 minutes I gave up, brewed another hot drink, and sat on the edge of my cot, reading everything I could find in the station's restricted archive about Earth and the humans and the quarantine and the fracture wars that had supposedly made all of this necessary. The official record was thin, surprisingly conspicuously thin. There were official summaries of the fracture wars going back 400 years, most of them vague about specifics and unanimous in their conclusion. Humanity had proven itself dangerously unpredictable during its first extraterrestrial encounters, had caused significant casualties through what the record described as disproportionate and indiscriminate responses to peaceful contact attempts, and had been placed under the quarantine for the protection of both the galactic community and humanity itself. That phrase came up repeatedly for their own good. The thing that nagged at me, reading through it all, was how little primary documentation existed. Summaries of summaries, reports citing reports that were themselves classified or unavailable. I had been a patrol officer for long enough to understand how bureaucracies worked, and I knew that significant events generated enormous amounts of documentation, witness accounts, technical analyses, diplomatic cables, after-action reports, damn it. Assessments 400 years ago, something important enough to justify quarantining an entire species had apparently taken place, and the documentary record was roughly the size of what you would expect from a minor border incident. That bothered me. I made a note of it. I was back at my console 2 hours before my shift was supposed to start when Draren came to find me. He had the expression of someone carrying news they would prefer to put down. I reached Fleet Commander Drasht at Sector Command. He said Drell Vash was not someone either of us had ever spoken to directly. He commanded the sector's enforcement fleet, oversaw all quarantine enforcement for the entire Earth adjacent region, and reported directly to the Conclave Quarantine Oversight Board. He was 3 levels of hierarchy above anything that was supposed to touch our monitoring post. What did I ask? He is sending a suppression fleet. Dr. Lauren sat down slowly. 8 vessels. They will arrive within 31 hours. I thought about the word suppression. I thought about the signal. We have been trying to reach you for 200 years, and the signal. I asked, did you tell him about the signal? Yes. What did he say about the signal? Driron looked at his hands for a moment. He said to treat it as a provocation and not to respond under any circumstances. I did not say anything. Voss, Driron said, which was the informal shortening of my name that he almost never used. Whatever conclusions you are currently drawing, I want you to document everything first. Everything, every data point, every time stamp, every transmission, put it somewhere it cannot be deleted. That was not something a man who believed the suppression fleet was going to handle this cleanly would say. I looked at him for a moment. You think this is bigger than they are treating it? I said. He did not confirm it. He did not deny it. He stood up, straightened his uniform, and went back to his console. I started copying data to a personal archive drive. The suppression fleet was still 29 hours out when the second signal arrived. Same narrowband channel, same compression structure, same mathematical preamble, but this time the message was longer. Whoever was sending it had either refined their translation matrix or had sent enough of them now that they were learning our language patterns in real time, because this one was cleaner, more precise. We know a fleet is coming. We are not afraid. We want to talk. We have things you should know. Please do not make the first conversation difficult. I stared at that last line for a long time. Please do not make the first conversation difficult. Not please do not come. Not please do not fire. Not a demand or a threat or a warning. Request to be reasonable. The kind of polite, weary request you made to someone you had been patient with for a very long time. I thought about the 100-year-old anomaly in the historical logs. Someone had come out here to study those buoys a century ago, had taken the readings, had gone back with the data, had spent however many decades since then working out what they had found, building on it, developing it, and then had come back recently to collect the units physically for further study, for reverse engineering. For what exactly? The answer arrived like a key sliding into a lock. They were not trying to break out of the quarantine. They were documenting it. learning it, understanding exactly what it was made of and how it worked. And species clever enough to do that, quietly, patiently over the course of a century, while giving no outward sign that anything was happening, was not a species that had spent 400 years in helpless containment. They had been sitting inside that perimeter by choice. The thought was staggering. I sat with it for several minutes, turning it over, looking for the flaw in it. I could not find one, because the alternative, that they had genuinely been contained all this time and had only now found a way out, did not account for the 100-year-old survey visit, did not account for the perfect mathematical precision of the current operation, did not account for a translation matrix sophisticated enough to be built from fragments of 3 different patrol communication standards, which would have required access to classified patrol documentation that no species under quarantine was supposed to have, unless the quarantine had never actually contained them, unless it had been, from their perspective, something else entirely. I thought about the word suppression. I thought about 8 warships being sent to a planet that, if I was right, had been watching us from inside a cage they could leave whenever they wanted, and I felt something in my chest that I would later describe in my report to the Interspecies Council as the first moment I understood that everything I had been told about this posting, this planet, and this rule might be backwards. The suppression fleet was 27 hours out now. I opened a blank document and began writing. Not a report, not yet, just notes. Everything I had found, everything I had concluded, everything that did not line up with the official record. I wrote quickly and without organizing it, the way you wrote when you needed to get the thoughts out before you could decide what to do with them. I had been a patrol officer for less than a year. I had never done anything that could be described as an act of independent judgment. Every decision I had made since the academy had been made within a clear chain of command, within a clear set of procedures, within a world that had clear rules and clear answers. The clear answer right now, the official answer, was to say nothing, do nothing, and wait for the suppression fleet to treat the signal as a provocation, to let Drell Vash handle it. I looked at my screen at the message still glowing there in the dark. Please do not make the first conversation difficult. I did not respond to the signal, but I kept copying data to my personal archive and I kept writing. The fleet was 22 hours out when Dr. Shammer's voice entered my life for the first time. I had been running a deep scan of the general broadcast spectrum around Earth, not the narrow band channel the signals had come in on, but the broader range of frequencies that any civilization generated simply by existing. And in that scan, I found something I had not been looking for, a data package, large, compressed, and addressed with precise targeting coordinates directly to post 11. It had been sent from the surface of Earth. I opened it. It contained a file, a long file, audio and text interred, with a date stamp going back 22 years, a personal log. The voice on the audio portions was a woman's voice, calm and dry, and occasionally amused with the cadence of someone who had been recording their thoughts for so long that they no longer thought about whether anyone was listening. The text portions were supplementary, technical notes, data summaries, references to other documents I did not have. The log began. I am Dr. Ashamaran, project lead. For the Threshold Initiative recording. For the archive, today we confirmed what the survey team reported in their preliminary analysis. The devices they found and brought back are not natural formations, they are engineered objects. Someone put them there. This changes everything we thought we understood about our situation, and I want to be precise about what I mean by that. I sat very still. I listened. Dr. Ashamaran had spent 22 years leading a project that humanity had named with characteristically understated confidence the Threshold Initiative. What I learned from her log over the next 3 hours was not the story of a species clawing desperately at the walls of its containment. It was the story of a species that had found the walls, studied them carefully, decided what they were and why they were there, and then gone about the long, patient work of deciding what to do about it. It started almost a century before Myron's first entry. A survey team working in high Earth orbit had recovered fragments of what they initially assumed was damaged equipment from their own early space program. Analysis proved otherwise. The materials were not from any human manufacturing process. The design logic was fundamentally different from anything humanity had developed or theorized in the fragments once there. Function was understood, were pieces of a monitoring device, specifically one of the interdiction buoys from the outer edge of the northern perimeter band. One had drifted far enough inward through some combination of orbital decay and gravitational drift over decades to cross into the range of a routine survey sweep. The team that recovered it did not panic. They quietly brought it home and spent 7 years taking it apart. What they found told them 3 things. First, the buoys were not purely passive monitors. They emitted a suppressive field, low-level, long-range, specifically tuned to the resonant frequencies of the type of faster than light drive humanity had been independently developing through theoretical physics research. In simple terms, the buoys were not just watching, they were blocking any attempt by humanity to test a functional FTL drive. Would have been suppressed at the field boundary, giving the impression of a technical failure and sending the engineers back to the drawing board. Quarantine was not just a fence, it was a ceiling. Second, the buoys contained archived communication records, not current transmissions, archived ones, stored in the unit's memory core, apparently as a calibration reference. Those records, painstakingly decoded over the following decades, contained fragments of patrol communications from the early period of the quarantine's establishment. Most were technical, some were administrative, a small number were not. Dr. Myron's voice was very level when she summarized what those communications contained: the fracture wars, the event that had supposedly demonstrated humanity's danger to the galaxy, the justification for 400 years of containment, the official record, which I had found conspicuously thin, was thin because the full record told a different story. The full record showed a first contact team that had not arrived with peaceful intentions, that had arrived with a resource extraction mandate from an unnamed conclave economic consortium that had, when met with resistance by a humanity that did not understand what was happening and was not given time to understand, responded with force first, that had escalated, that had caused the very casualties later attributed in the official record to human aggression, and When the dust settled, the conclave had looked at the situation, understood what the documentation implied about their own actions, and classified everything. Quarantined the species, rewrote the summary, Myron said, recording alone what sounded like a small office late at night. I want to be very clear in this record that when our team understood what we had found, there was a significant discussion about what to do with it. There were people who argued for immediate confrontation, for broadcasting the records, for doing whatever was necessary to make the galaxy know what had actually happened. I understood that argument, I still do. But we had to ask a harder question, not what we had a right to do, what we were actually trying to accomplish, if we wanted to be free and recognized and treated as equals in a galactic community. Broadcasting evidence of an old crime while we were still enclosed and outgunned was not the path to that. The path to that was patient preparation, legal documentation, and being in a position of undeniable capability before we asked for anything. 22 years of entries, building the Threshold Initiative from a small research team into a global program, developing FTL theory carefully, and theoretical papers that never drew too much external attention, testing drives in shielded environments underground, where the buoy suppression field could not reach, solving one by one every technical problem standing between humanity and the stars, not because the stars were the goal, but because capability was the goal, because no one negotiated with someone they could simply ignore. And while all of this was happening, while humanity was quietly becoming a space-faring civilization inside the shell of its quarantine, a second project was running in parallel. Contact Project Communication Theory. Decades of work decoding the patrols, language structures from the fragments in the BU archives, building translation matrices, developing a communication protocol that could be transmitted on patrol frequencies and be recognizable as deliberate and structured without being automatically flagged as a threat. 200 years of attempts, most ignored, some she suspected, intercepted, and suppressed before reaching anyone with authority to respond. She was not bitter about this, or if she was, she did not let it into her voice. She was across 22 years of recordings, consistent in exactly one emotional register, patient, the kind of patience that had been earned through very long and very clear-eyed understanding of what she was up against. The last entry in the log was recorded 6 days ago. We are going ahead with the physical retrieval of the Northern Band units. If this doesn't get their attention, I don't know what will. Though honestly, I think they've known about us for longer than they've admitted. The signal responses we've been tracking suggest Post 11 has been receiving our transmissions at least since the last narrow band series. Someone up there is listening, I hope. They're the right kind of person, I hope. They're ready for this, I hope we are. She paused for a moment, and in the pause, I heard what 22 years of recording had not once let through. Something that might have been nerves. Not fear, just the breath of someone standing on the edge of something enormous and knowing it. Entry complete, she said then, as if she had almost forgotten. Oh, and we have ships 27 visible for the initial greeting, more available if the greeting goes badly. Though I really hope it doesn't go badly. I've been working on that part. The longest. The log ended. I sat in the silence of my monitoring station for a Long time, the suppression fleet was 14 hours out, 27 visible, more available if needed. I thought about that with a very specific kind of vertigo. A species that had been quietly building an interstellar fleet inside a quarantine zone over decades without any of our long-range sensors picking up the industrial signature of that construction. They had been that careful, that thorough, that far ahead of every assumption we had built this entire posting on. I thought about Dr. Vashd, 8 warships, a conclave mandate, 4 centuries of authority arriving to suppress a contact scenario involving a civilization that had been studying us for 100 years, had reverse engineered our technology from first principles, had an independent interstellar fleet, and had responded to 400 years of imprisonment with a 22-year personal log asking, patiently, please do not make the first conversation difficult. I opened a secure channel too. Doctor, I need you to read something, I said. There was a pause. How long is it? 22 years, I said. I'll summarize. The suppression fleet dropped out of faster than light travel at the outer edge of the quarantine perimeter at 400 station time. Fleet Commander Devash commanding from the lead vessel, 8 warships in standard approach formation, weapons hot, shields active, every scanner on, every ship pointed at Earth. They found 27 human vessels waiting for them. Not approaching, not retreating, waiting. Positioned in a loose ring just inside the perimeter's former northern band, which by now was almost entirely dark. Engines cold, weapon signatures absent. Shields down, which was either an act of trust or an act of confidence, so complete that shield seemed beside the point. The human ships were not what anyone had been expecting. They were not sleek the way patrol vessels were sleek. They were built the way something was built when the people building it had started from first principles and solved every problem themselves. A little rough in the aesthetics, extraordinarily solid in the engineering. They were large. Several of them were very large, and they had been constructed with a design logic that I, looking at the scanner readouts from my station, found genuinely elegant in a way that reminded me of the buoy fragment analysis in Myron's log. They had started from scratch and ended up somewhere interesting. I was patched into the fleet's communication feed. DLV had not asked for my input, but Darren had quietly added my credentials to the monitoring access, which I suspect he was not strictly authorized to do, and which I was grateful for. The first communication came from the human vessels 40 seconds after the fleet's arrival. Same narrow band compression structure as the transmissions to my station, but broader now, open up into the full fleet communication range. Clear and strong. Welcome to the edge of our space. We have been expecting you. We would like to begin formal communication at your convenience. We are unarmed for this meeting. We understand if you are not, and we are not offended by that. Please take whatever time you need. Devash did not respond for 4 minutes. I could not see him, but I could imagine him sitting in his command chair looking at those 27 ships, doing his own calculations about what he was looking at, and finding that the numbers were not adding up to anything he had been briefed on. When he responded, his voice was even unprofessional and carrying the particular edge of a man who had been handed a situation that no existing protocol covered. This is Fleet Commander Drell Vash of the Galactic Patrol Sector 7 Enforcement. You are in violation of Quarantine Order 417, as established by the Galactic Conclave. You are ordered to withdraw to the planetary boundary and cease all further unauthorized space operations pending a formal review. A pause from the human side. Then we understand your position. Commander, we would respectfully point out that the quarantine order you reference was established unilaterally, without treaty, without the consent of the party it was applied to, and without any legal framework recognized under the general principles of galactic civil law, as codified by the Third Conclave Charter. We have prepared documentation on this point. It is approximately 200 pages. We apologize for the length. In the silence that followed, I thought about Dr. Myron recording quietly in her office 22 years of patient preparation, and felt something that I later understood was admiration. Devash said very carefully, "Who am I speaking to?" "My name is Dr. Ashamaran. I am the civilian lead for the Threshold Initiative, which is the program responsible for this operation. I am also, I suppose, the closest thing to a first contact representative that humanity currently has, which I recognize is informal. We can arrange more official representation if you prefer, but that would take approximately 3 days, and I thought it might be more productive to start talking now." Another silence. Drelesht was a professional. He did not let his voice crack, but when he spoke again, there was something in his tone that had not been there before. The tone of a man discovering that the briefing he had received was in some fundamental way inadequate. "Dr. Murren, this channel is not authorized for creation. I understand. We are not negotiating on this channel. We are simply talking. Negotiation implies a disagreement about what is wanted. We know what we want. We have known for quite some time. We would like to be recognized as a space-faring civilization, to have the quarantine formally dissolved, and to enter into normal diplomatic relations with the galactic community. Those are our goals. We are prepared to discuss the means. We are not prepared to re-enter the quarantine under any circumstances. I want to be very clear about that last point." Devash put the channel on hold. I could hear him speaking to someone off mic rapidly, and though the transmission was muffled, I caught the words "command" and "conclave," and not in the briefing, which told me everything about the state of his composure. He came back on the channel 90 seconds later. "Dr. Murren, this situation requires a face-to-face meeting. I am inviting a delegation to come aboard the command vessel for preliminary discussions. I want to be clear that these discussions will not constitute formal recognition of any kind." "We understand completely," Mayan said. "We will send 4 representatives. We would like to bring food. We have a human beverage called tea that travels well and that we think you might enjoy. Is that acceptable?" Another pause. "Acceptable." I looked at Doctor across our monitoring room. He was staring at his display with an expression I had never seen on his face before. It took me a moment to identify it as wonder. I was not part of the delegation. I was a cadet at a monitoring post, not a diplomat or an officer of sufficient rank to be present at first contact, but Drell Oren, through a series of quiet authorizations that I think he may also not have been strictly cleared to make, managed to get me assigned as a communication support specialist on the command vessel, which meant I was present in the back of the room at a translation console that I was technically supposed to be monitoring, while actually watching everything. Dr. Ashamaran was shorter than I had imagined. She had the kind of face that would have looked completely ordinary if it were not animated by a quality of attention that I could only describe as absolute. She noticed everything. Her three colleagues were quiet and watchful, and clearly deeply competent in ways. Their professional stillness communicated more than words would have. They set up their equipment with the practiced ease of people who had rehearsed this a great many times. They had brought tea. They had also brought a data core that one of them sat quietly on the conference table without comment. I would learn what was on it later. Dr. Vivash opened the meeting with the Standard Patrol First Contact Protocol, which was designed for encounters with pre-interstellar civilizations and was, therefore, somewhat absurdly inapplicable here, but which he delivered with full professional dignity. Mayan listened to all of it with complete courtesy and without a flicker of impatience, which struck me as a remarkable discipline, given that she was sitting across a table from the representative of the organization that had confined her species for 400 years. When Drell Vash finished, she thanked him and asked if she might make a short presentation. He said yes. She opened a display. It showed a star map. The quarantine perimeter was marked on it in clear notation around the edges of the map. Outside the perimeter were small icons: vessels, installations, monitoring posts, patrol assets, and then inside the perimeter, in the space that was supposed to contain only Earth and its quarantined occupants, there were other icons, human icons, dozens of them. Ship stations, survey platforms, a manufacturing complex around Jupiter, and what appeared to be 3 permanent settlements on other bodies within the solar system. The room was very quiet. We have been inside this perimeter for 400 years. Mayan said we have used the time well. We are not asking for permission to leave. We have already left, in the sense that we are capable of leaving. What we are asking for is recognition. The difference between those two things matters to us. We could have forced this conversation at any point in the last 60 years. We chose not to, because we wanted to be in a position where this conversation could happen calmly and productively, rather than as a crisis requiring an immediate armed response. She paused. I understand. An armed fleet was dispatched anyway. We are choosing to take that in the spirit of understandable caution rather than hostility. Divash said you are sustaining that you have had faster than light capability for 60 years, 63 years. Myron said our first successful FTL test was conducted in a shielded underground facility, which is why your sensor it did not detect it. We have been careful. You are stating that you have permanently inhabited other bodies, your solar system, for 40 years. Yes. Small populations initially, larger now. You are stating that you built all of this. Dr. Vivash gestured at the display, without any of our sensors detecting it. Your sensors are very good, Mayan said, with what I recognized as genuine respect rather than condescension. We had to be better. It took us a long time. Another silence. Then Drell Vash said, with the tone of a man arriving at a question he had been avoiding, why are you still inside the perimeter? If you have had this capability for 60 years, why have you not simply left? Mayan looked at him for a moment. Because we did not want a war, she said. We wanted Recognition, they are not the same thing. And we have always been very clear about which one we wanted. She reached forward and touched the data core on the table. This contains our complete documentation, the legal case for the quarantine's invalidity, the historical record of the first contact period, including materials we recovered from the perimeter buoys that may not be available in your accessible archives, and our formal request for recognition as a space-faring civilization and member of the galactic community with accompanying proposal for a transition framework. Drill Vash looked at the data core. You said materials recovered from the buoys. Yes, what materials? Mayans. Voice was very even. The original communication records from the first contact period prior to classification. We understand those may be sensitive. We are not presenting them as an accusation. We are presenting them as context. We believe context is important for this conversation to be productive. The room was extremely quiet. Drill Vash put his hand on the data core and did not pick it up. I was watching from the back of the room, fingers resting on my translation console that I was not actually using, and I thought about what was on that core, what Myron's 22-year log had told me, what the buoy archives had contained, what the official record had been so carefully thin about. I looked at Dr. Vash's hand on the data core. I thought he already knows or suspects he was sent here not to handle a first contact but to prevent one, and the people who sent him know exactly why. My poured tea into a ceramic vessel she had brought, set it in the middle of the table and pushed it gently toward Vash's side. He looked at it. What is it like? He asked, and I heard in his voice very faintly the crack that his professionalism had been working to prevent. Warm, she said slightly. Bitter, better than you think it will be. He did not reach for it, but he did not move his hand away either. I was beginning to understand that the rule, do not wake the humans, had never been about humanity's danger to the galaxy. It had been about something much simpler. It had been about what would happen when a species that had been wronged patiently, quietly, and with full documentation finally sat down across a table and asked to be acknowledged, and did not ask with fury, asked with 200 pages of legal argument, a star map of everything they had built. In the dark and a pot of tea, the Conclave emergency channel opened 40 minutes into the meeting. I heard it through my console earpiece before anyone else in the room reacted to it, because my console was still technically monitoring all incoming fleet communications. The notification was marked highest priority, which was a classification I had only ever seen in theoretical training scenarios. It pulsed on my display in the color that meant something had changed that was not supposed to be able to change. I listened. My face remained neutral through a considerable effort of will. The notification was brief. A species under quarantine, Order 611, the Velhari, had just broadcast a public announcement on open galactic frequencies. They were citing by name and timestamp the events at Earth's northern perimeter as precedent. They were declaring their own quarantine void under the same legal arguments they had apparently been developing for some time. They were requesting immediate recognition from any conclave member state willing to respond. 6 minutes later, a second notification, the dress under quarantine, Order 704, had done the same. I removed my earpiece before the third Notifications arrived, not because I did not want to know, but because I needed a moment to understand what was happening. And what was happening in the space of about 20 minutes was that the entire architecture of the conclave's quarantine policy was coming apart in real time on public frequencies in front of the galactic community. I could see it in the small shift of her expression when the commotion reached Devash's adjutants and the room began to change in temperature. She did not look surprised. She did not look satisfied in the way of someone who had set a trap. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a very specific thing to finally happen and was experiencing the complicated feeling of watching it arrive. Devash's aide leaned down and said something quiet in his ear. He went very still. Then he said to Myron, "Did you coordinate this?" Myron said carefully, "The Vilhari and the Dres are civilizations we have been in contact with for several decades. We have shared information with them. We have not coordinated their actions. We have simply told them the truth about what we found in the Bew archives, and they have made their own decisions. You contacted other quarantine species. We did without authorization." Mayan led a small silence. "Land Commander, we have been inside a quarantine that was placed on us without authorization based on a legal order that we have documented as invalid in response to events that we have documented as misrepresented. Authorization from the organization responsible for all of that was not something we were in a position to wait for." DL Vash stood up. He was not angry in the way that people who had lost control were angry. He was angry in the way that people who were very close to losing control and were not going to let that happen were angry. "I need to consult with command," he said. "This meeting is temporarily suspended." Of course, Mayan said. "We will wait." Drill Vash and his senior staff left the room. The human delegation sat quietly. One of Myron's colleagues poured himself more tea. Mayan herself sat with her hands folded on the table and looked at nothing in particular, which I recognized, having now spent some time in her company, as her thinking face. "I should have stayed at my console. I did not." I crossed the room and sat in the empty chair nearest the human delegation, which was technically a significant breach of my authorization as a background communication support specialist, and I looked at Dr. Ashamaran across the table. She looked back at me. She seemed quietly unsurprised. "You are from the monitoring post," she said. "Not a question." "Yes." "You listened to the log?" "Yes." She nodded once. "Was it useful?" I thought about that for a moment. "It was the most important thing I have ever read," I said. She seemed to consider this. "Good," she said. "Then what is your name?" "Vosarin V." She repeated it in a way that suggested she was filing it. "Do you believe what you read?" "Yes." "Does your commander believe it?" I looked toward the door that Dr. Vash had left through. "I think he has access to information that makes it difficult not to believe, but believing it and acting on it are different problems." She nodded. "That has been our experience for 400 years. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The conclave is going to authorize a military response, not to us directly. The optics of that are complicated now with the Vilhari and the Dres going public simultaneously, but there will be pressure to resolve this before it becomes a full destabilization of the quarantine system." "How do you know?" "Because that is what an organization that has built its power on the suppression of this particular truth. Would do she met my eyes. I want to tell you something, Voss Aaron and I want you to consider it carefully. We are not afraid of a military response. We have prepared for that possibility for 60 years, but a military response means people are hurt on both sides, and we have spent 400 years trying not to let that happen. We need someone on the inside of this to understand clearly what the stakes are and to make a choice about what kind of officer they want to be. I was 22 years old. I had been a patrol officer for less than a year. She was asking me with complete clarity and no pressure at all whether I was going to be the kind of person who stood at the back of the room and did what I was told, or the kind of person who made a different choice. I thought about Doctor, about his instruction to document everything and put it somewhere it could not be deleted. I thought about the data core on the table, about what was on it, about 400 years of a story told wrong. What would you need? I said. Mayan reached into her case and placed a second smaller data core on the table. The same documentation that is on the larger core, compressed for individual transmission if the conclave authorizes a military response, and if that authorization order is broadcast on a classified channel before it reaches its destination. There are 14 member species of the conclave who would have to vote immediately on whether to continue supporting the policy. 14 is enough for a procedural halt. She looked at me steadily. We are not asking you to do anything. We are giving you information. What you do with information is always your own decision. I looked at the small core. I looked at the door, the classified channel. I said, I have access to that. I am monitoring it right now. I know, said Mayan. Somewhere in the Fleet Communication Network, another notification arrived. A third quarantine species had gone public, then a fourth. I picked up the data core and put it in my pocket. 3 hours after I transmitted the conclave strike authorization order to 14 member species news networks simultaneously, the lead warships of the enforcement fleet received a recall order from their own home governments, not from command, from home. 6 ships pulled out of formation. Inside 90 minutes, their captains issuing identical brief statements pending review of new information. Further action in this sector had been suspended. Devash watched 2/3 of his fleet dissolve from the command bridge, and to his considerable credit, he did not try to stop them. He was a man who had spent his career following orders, and he could recognize, I suspected, the precise moment when following a specific order was going to destroy everything the institution he served was supposed to stand for. He did not authorize the strike. He also did not arrest me, which I had not been certain about. I had placed the data core in my pocket in front of 2 witnesses and had made a transmission from a classified channel that he could pull the logs on at any time. When his aide came to find me, I expected the conversation to go badly. Instead, his aide handed me a written order transferring me to diplomatic liaison support effective immediately, and told me to report to the conference room. I went to the conference room. Devash was sitting at the table alone. The human delegation had been returned to their vessel while the recall situation resolved itself. On the table in front of him was the data core that Myron had placed there hours earlier. It was open. He had read it. He looked at me when I Came in, he did not say anything about. The transmission, he did not say. Anything about the data core in my pocket, he said, the Valhari representative is requesting a communication link and the dress and two others. They are asking for humanity to facilitate, and Dr. Mayan is standing by. He said, she said she thought I might want a few minutes first. He looked at the data core. She was right, he was quiet for a moment. Then how old are you, cadet? 22, sir. You took a significant risk. Yes, sir, for a species you had never met before. Yesterday, I thought about what to say. I thought about 22 years of recorded patience, about a woman sitting in an office late at night describing the mathematics of a drive that humanity had rebuilt from fragments of alien engineering because someone had caged them and told them they were not ready. About 200 years of signals aimed at a monitoring station asking quietly, persistently to be heard. I had met them. I said I had read the log. Devash looked at me for a long moment, then he nodded once slowly and picked up the communication handset. The meeting that followed lasted 11 hours. By the end of it, the formal suppression order had been suspended. A temporary ceasefire framework had been agreed and a request had been transmitted to the conclave for an emergency full-session review of the quarantine policy under new information provisions. Devash signed the request himself. I was there for all of it, mostly at the back of the room at my console, which I was now actually using. But present, Mayan caught my eye once in the middle of the third hour during a recess. She did not say anything. She simply raised the ceramic vessel in her hand, which still had tea in it, very slightly. I nodded back. Outside, the stars were where they had always been. The perimeter buoys were dark, and somewhere behind us, on open galactic frequencies, a fourth and fifth quarantine species were telling the truth about themselves for the first time in centuries. The recall notices kept coming. I watched them stack up on my console feed, tour identical in structure, each one a ship captain invoking domestic executive authority rather than patrol command authority. That distinction mattered. They were not defecting from the fleet. They were responding to their home governments, which had received the broadcast documentation and were now in the middle of emergency legislative sessions that were happening simultaneously across 6 different star systems. Politics moved slowly in the galaxy, except when the evidence of something unforgivable was placed directly in front of elected officials on a live news feed, and every citizen with a communication device was watching. Devash had 2 ships left by the time the last recall notice arrived. His own command vessel and a single escort frigate whose captain, a woman named Orelvesh, stood at his side throughout and did not speak. She was the kind of officer who understood that some moments required presence more than words. I was still at my console. The room around me had changed in the way that rooms changed when events outgrew the spaces they were happening in. People moving faster, speaking in shorter sentences, the communications traffic on every channel spiking and overlapping. Dr. Vash Aid was coordinating with Conclave administrative channels and not finding any comfort there. The strike authorization that I had broadcast was not something that could be recalled or denied. It existed now in the public record of 14 independent news organizations, each of which had their own legal mandate to preserve and report what they had received, I thought, sitting in that room about the moment I had picked up the smaller data core from the table. It had been a clear-headed decision, not a panicked one, and that fact had surprised me about myself. At the time, I had not felt the particular fear of someone doing something they knew was wrong. I had felt the particular clarity of someone doing something they knew was right, which was a different and in some ways more unsteadying sensation, because clarity did not make the consequences smaller. It only made them easier to look at. The consequences were currently visible on my display in the form of 6 warships pulling away from formation, and the Conclave's emergency communication protocols lighting up like something was burning. The strike authorization order had been sent by the Conclave's Internal Security Directorate, which had issued it without convening a full member vote, using an emergency provision that technically required imminent physical threat to a member state. No member state had been threatened. Earth was inside its own former quarantine boundary and had done nothing except exist, build ships, and ask politely to be recognized. The emergency provision had been invoked not because of a genuine threat, but because someone in the Directorate had decided that the public emergence of the historical records constituted an institutional threat, which was technically not what the provision covered. When the 14 news organizations published the order, alongside that context, the response from member species governments was fast and not gentle. Mayan had known this would happen. I understood that now with complete clarity. She had not handed me the core as a desperate measure or a gamble. She had handed it to me as the final piece of a mechanism she had been building for 22 years, and she had handed it to the right person at the right moment, because she had spent 22 years thinking about who the right person would be and what the right moment looked like. She had been very, very patient. I pulled up the Galactic public news feed on a secondary display. The coverage was extraordinary, not just the strike order, though that was the lead item everywhere. The full historical record from the Buoy archives had been attached to the data core Myron had placed on the DRL Vash's table, and that core had been read, and its contents were now in circulation. The first contact period, the economic extraction mandate, the escalation that the official record had attributed to human aggression, the classification decision that had followed. It was not the kind of information that could be argued away. It was primary documentation with authentication signatures still intact, 4 centuries old, carrying the administrative identifiers of the conclave bureaus that had generated it, the bureaus that had then classified it, the bureaus whose successor organizations had spent 4 centuries maintaining a quarantine that existed, as Myron had stated calmly across a conference table, not to protect the galaxy from humanity, but to protect the record from scrutiny. The comment feeds under every news report were unlike anything I had seen in the galactic public sphere. Hundreds of thousands of responses from dozens of species, and the overwhelming majority of them were not arguing about what had happened. They were asking why. Why had no one known? Why had this been permitted to continue for 400 years? Why, when the conclave's own procedural charter contained an explicit prohibition on indefinite quarantine orders applied without treaty, had no one ever raised a legal challenge? The answer to that last Question was in Mayan's briefing. Documents, she had anticipated it. Mechanism for raising a legal challenge. Required standing, required the capacity to file documentation through recognized galactic legal channels, and the quarantine order had specifically denied humanity standing by classifying them as a precon species. You could not file a legal challenge from inside a cage that defined you by its own terms as something that was not yet qualified to file legal challenges. She had spent 22 years building the standing that the quarantine had been designed to prevent her from having every technical development, every legal document, every communication attempt, every diplomatic note. They were not just preparations for first contact, they were the accumulation of a legal and factual record that established beyond any procedural argument that humanity was exactly what the quarantine said they were not: a developed, capable, self-determining civilization with full standing under galactic civil law. Quarantine had defined them asleep. She had spent 22 years documenting in extraordinary detail how awake they were. On the news feed, a legal scholar from the Dresh civilization was giving a live analysis of the authorization order's procedural invalidity. She had clearly been waiting for exactly this moment, which meant Myron's outreach to the Dres had included coordination with their legal community. The analysis was precise, thorough, and already being cited by 3-member species legislative bodies in their emergency session proceedings. Devash walked back into the communications room. He looked at me at my display at the news feed. I had not bothered to minimize. He sat down. The Conclave Directorate is demanding I proceed with the strike, he said. He said it to the room generally, not to me specifically, in the manner of someone saying something out loud, because it required being said out loud before anyone could respond to it. Orvs, who had followed him in, said, "With what fleet, sir?" It was not a challenge. It was a practical observation. He had 2 ships, a strike with 2 ships against the installation capacity that the human star map had displayed would not be a military operation. It would be a gesture, and a catastrophically poorly timed one, given that the public documentation of the first contact history was currently being consumed by the entire galactic community in real time. Devash was quiet for a long moment. Then he said to no one in particular, "Open a channel to doctor me." It opened in seconds. She was on her ship somewhere in the cluster of 27 vessels that were still holding their position with their engines cold. When her voice came through, she sounded exactly as she had sounded in the conference room. Unhurried, clear, present. "Commander," she said, "the Directorate has issued a strike authorization." A pause. "We know. You know it has been on the news networks for approximately 40 minutes. She did not say this with any satisfaction. She said it the way you said something that was simply true. "Commander, I thought to say something directly, and I hope you will take it in the spirit it is offered. We did not come here to create a crisis. We came here to end one. The Director's authorization is not your authorization. You are a patrol officer. The patrol's founding charter, which predates the Conclave's administrative restructuring by 60 years, contains a provision that an officer of field command rank may decline to execute an order if the execution of that order would constitute a demonstrable violation of the 3rd Conclave Charter's civil protections. I would not presume to tell you what to do. I would ask you to read Article 44 of the founding charter before you make any decision. A silence. I know Article 44. Drash said, I thought you might. Said, you have been a patrol officer for a long time. The patrol's values are older than the directorate's current leadership. He was quiet for another moment. Then if I formally decline the order, there will be a review proceeding. Yes, she said, we will testify on your behalf, as will I. Expect a significant portion of the 14 species whose governments just recalled their ships. The review proceeding will not go badly for you, Commander. I have been thinking about your situation for quite some time. That was the moment I thought later that Drell Vash fully understood what he was dealing with, not a confrontational species demanding its rights, not a political movement seizing an opportunity, a civilization that had spent 400 years thinking carefully about every person who would be in every room when this moment arrived, and who had prepared quietly and thoroughly for all of them. He closed the channel. He pulled up article of the patrol founding charter. He read it. Then he dictated a formal written response to the Directorate strike authorization, citing Article 44, Paragraph 3, and declined to execute the order on the grounds that its target, having been demonstrably established as a developed and self-determining civilization under the standards of the Third Conclave Charter, did not meet the criteria for enforcement action under existing patrol operational guidelines. He sent it. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Someone get Dr. Mayan back on the channel, he said. We have a lot to talk about. The Interspecies Council convened for the first time 14 months after what the galactic press with unusual anonymity had taken to calling the opening. The conclave did not dissolve overnight. Nothing significant ever does, but the emergency full session review that Drell Vash had requested produced what the procedural optimists among the conclave's member species called a significant restructuring, and what everyone else called a reckoning. 7 senior members of the Quarantine Oversight Board resigned before the proceedings concluded. 3 conclave administrative directorates were dissolved and rebuilt with new mandates and public accountability requirements that had not previously existed. The quarantine orders were not simply canceled. They were formally voided, a legal distinction that mattered because voiding required an acknowledgement that they had been invalid in the first place, which required an acknowledgement of the first contact period. Records that humanity had recovered from the Buell archives. That acknowledgement did not come easily. It came through approximately 11 months of procedural argument, 3 formal hearings, and the kind of grinding institutional pressure that Myron's 200-page legal brief had been specifically built to apply. She was not present for most of it. She sent lawyers, good ones. The new Inter-Species Council was built on a structure that the old conclave had never had: equal representation regardless of technological development level, regardless of the duration of space, faring status, regardless of the economic weight of the member civilization, 1 species, 1 seat, equal voice. The Velhari and the Dress held seats for other formerly quarantined species once they had worked through their own versions of the opening held seats. Humanity held a seat. mirror and did not take it. She sent a young diplomat named George Adler who was 26 years old and had the same quality of unhurried attention that she had, and who showed up to the first council session with a small bag, a data slate, and the particular expression of someone who had been told they had a very important job to do and intended to do it well without making a production of it. I was present for his arrival, because by that point I had been serving as humanity's formal patrol liaison for 6 months, a role that had not existed before and that I was making up as I went along with the quiet support of Dr. Loran, who had been promoted following the opening and who had, in his methodical and understated way, done more to facilitate the transition than anyone had publicly credited him for. I watched Adler take his seat at the new council table, watched him set up his data slate with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to working in complex environments, watched the representatives of 14 other civilizations, some of whom had been enemies of the old conclave, some of whom were newly emerged from their own containment, some of whom were veteran conclave members who had voted for the restructuring. Look at this young human diplomat with the particular mixture of curiosity and respect that the opening had made almost universal. Humanity had a reputation now, not the reputation the quarantine mythology had built. Dangerous, unpredictable, the species you did not wake, the actual reputation, the one built from 400 years of patient work and 200 pages of careful legal argument and a first conversation conducted over a thermos of tea. I had filed a report in my capacity as liaison about the events of the opening. The report had been long and detailed, and one of its sections addressed the law, the rule no one had written down, the warning every species learned before anything else: do not wake the humans. The Interessees Council had, after considerable discussions, formally removed the law from the patrol's operating charter. It had no legal basis. It had never had a legal basis. It was mythology passed from species to species, built on a history that had been deliberately distorted and had distorted everything it touched. They had replaced it with a single principle, proposed by the human delegation and accepted by the full council after the briefest debate of the entire 14-month process. Never assume a species is asleep just because it is quiet. George Adler settled into his council seat with the practiced ease of someone who had been preparing for this moment as for his entire professional life, while giving no outward sign that anything was at stake. He was 26 years old, which made him young even by human standards, and he had the particular quality that I had come to recognize as distinctly characteristic of the people Myron chose for important work, a kind of comprehensive attentiveness that took in everything without signaling that it was doing so. He listened to other delegates with the full attention of someone who considered listening to be a form of respect rather than simply a pause between speaking turns. He did not interrupt. He did not perform confidence. He was simply there fully. And after 2 sessions of the new council, it was already quietly obvious that the other delegates had begun to direct their more complicated arguments toward him first. Mayan had done that deliberately. I asked her about it when I visited Earth, walking through the research facility where the Threshold Initiative had operated for most of its existence. She had shown me the original Analysis lab where the first boy buoy fragment had been taken apart, which was now a small museum of sorts, not officially designated as one, just a room that had been preserved because they people who worked there could not bring themselves to change it. The fragment itself was mounted on a simple stand in the center of the room. It looked smaller than I had imagined. Why Adler? I asked. She considered. Because he is genuinely curious about other people. She said, not curious about them as political problems to be managed. Curious about them as people, that is rarer than it sounds, even among diplomats. She looked at the fragment. For a moment, the galaxy spent 400 years afraid of us. First thing our council representative needed to be was someone who made that fear look silly, not by being impressive, by being interested. We walked through the rest of the facility, and she showed me things I had read about in the log, but which were different in person. The theoretical physics archive, 80 years of computational work preserved on a server farm that had been built and rebuilt 6 times over the decades as the hardware aged. The communications lab where the translation matrix had been developed and refined through 2 centuries of failed transmissions and incremental improvement. The engineering bay where the FTL drive prototypes had been built, tested, disassembled, and rebuilt again, underground in carefully shielded conditions for 63 years before the first successful open space test. There was a photograph on the wall of the engineering bay, a group of people in practical work clothes standing in front of what was clearly a very early prototype. Rough, oversized, covered in manual calibration marks. They were smiling, not the formal smiles of people being photographed for an official record. The loose, honest smiles of people who were genuinely happy to be exactly where they were, doing exactly what they were doing. Who are they? I asked. Mayan came to stand beside me and looked at the photograph for a moment. The team that proved the theoretical model was viable, she said. 81 years ago. Most of them are gone now, but their children worked on this program, and their children's children. She paused. That was what people misunderstood about what we were doing. They thought patience was a strategy. It was not only a strategy. It was a way of life. You do not sustain a project across 4 generations by discipline alone. You sustain it by making it something people want to be part of, something they are proud of, something they pass down. I thought about that on the transit vessel on the way back. 4 generations of people who had lived their entire lives inside a quarantine they knew was unjust, building a response that they would not live to complete, trusting that the people who came after them would carry it forward, not out of obligation, out of genuine investment in something larger than themselves. The star map on my liaison office display now showed something that still occasionally stopped me mid-task. Where there had been a quarantine boundary, there were transit corridors, ships moving in and out of Earth system openly on logged routes with standard clearances, 43 on an average day. Myron had said the number was climbing. Adler calmed me from the council chambers one evening. 4 months into the new council's first session, he had a question about a procedural matter, a proposed amendment to the contact protocol framework that one of the veteran conclave member species was pushing through committee, which contained language that looked neutral but which would, if passed, create a presidential basis for reimposing developmental restrictions on newly emerged civilizations, not a quarantine, something subtler, a set of graduated trade restrictions tied to a technology assessment process that the veteran members controlled. He had caught it, he had read it 3 times to make sure he was reading it correctly. And then he had calmed me because I had been at the opening and he wanted to know if his read was right. It was right. How do you want to handle it? I asked. I want to understand the amendment sponsor before I respond, he said. Not politically, I mean I want to understand what she actually wants, what she is actually afraid of, because people don't propose bad faith policy for no reason. There's usually something under it. I told him what I knew about the delegate in question, a veteran member of the old conclave structure who had voted for the restructuring, which meant she was not a defender of the old order, but who had also spent 40 years working within an institutional framework that the opening had fundamentally disrupted. She was not, I suspected, trying to rebuild the quarantine system. She was trying to manage the pace of change in a way that felt controllable, so she's scared. Adler said. All right, he said. I'm going to ask if I can buy her lunch. Is that a thing the council does? Can delegates just have lunch? It was in fact a thing the council did. Adler had lunch with the delegate 3 days later and came back from it with a revised understanding of her concerns and a counter-proposal that addressed the legitimate ones while removing the problematic presidential language. She co-signed it. It passed in committee by a wide margin. He calmed me afterward, briefly, to let me know he sounded the same as always, attentive, unhurried, not particularly interested in being congratulated. He just wanted to close the loop. I thought after that call about what Myron had said on Earth, not curious about them as political problems to be managed, curious about them as people. I had been watching Adler work for 4 months, and I had not once seen him treat a political problem as a political problem first. He treated it as a people problem first, which meant he often found solutions that the people involved did not know they were open to. That was not a diplomatic technique. It was a disposition. It was what you became when you grew up in a civilization that had spent 400 years understanding very clearly that the difference between a conflict and a conversation was almost always just a question of who was willing to slow down and listen. I fought my quarterly liaison report on a clear morning, sitting at the desk in the small office the council had assigned me. The window faced east, and the light came in at an angle that made the dust in the air visible, which I found oddly pleasant. Outside, ships moved against the sky, not as many as over Earth, but enough to be visible, enough to be normal, the kind of normal that took a long time to build. The report covered 14 items: updates on the contact protocol framework negotiations, progress reports on the Velhar and Dres integration timelines, a summary of the drill vast review proceeding, which had concluded in his favor as Murren had predicted it would, and which had quietly resulted in a reform of the Directorate's emergency authorization procedures, a note on the 3 formerly quarantined species that were still in early-stage contact protocols and would not be fully integrated for several years yet, moving at their own pace, which the new council framework explicitly protected their right to do. The last item was personal, not required, not standard, I had included personal observations in my reports before, and my supervisors had allowed it to stand, which I thought said something good about the institutional culture that was being built. The principle that replaced the law is working not because it is printed in the charter, because the people in these rooms are actually practicing it. When Adler sits across from a delegate who is afraid of something, he asks what she is afraid of. When Drell Vash reviews a protocol that does not cover a new situation, he asks what the protocol was trying to accomplish and whether there is a better way to accomplish it. These are small things. They are also the only things that matter in the long run. Organizations do not change because their written rules change. They change because the people inside them start treating each other differently. I submitted the report, closed my display, looked at the light coming through the window. On Earth, in a research facility that was mostly a museum now. Photograph hung on the wall of an engineering bay, people smiling in front of something rough and oversized and covered in calibration marks. 4 generations before the work was done. 3 more generations of people who woke up every morning knowing that what they were building would change the shape of everything, and that they would not be there to see it, but that someone would never assume a species is asleep just because it is quiet. They were never asleep, they were just working. On the morning of the council's first formal session, I received a message from Dr. Mayan. She was back on Earth. She said, working on something new, and would I be willing to visit sometime? Because there were things she wanted to show me that were easier to understand in person. I wrote back that I would be there as soon as I could arrange transport. She replied almost immediately. She said she had taken the liberty of having a transit vessel cleared for my use through the new liaison office because she had assumed I would say yes. She said the journey would take approximately 9 hours and that she had sent a list of recommended reading for the trip. She had also sent tea vacuum sealed with a small card. Better than you think it will be, the card said. She was right, I thought. Sitting in that transit vessel with my reading list and my tea and the dark of open space outside the viewport, about the monitoring station, about the first night watching buoys go dark in a sequence too perfect to be failure, about the signal that had arrived like a question asked at exactly the right volume, not shouted, not whispered, aimed precisely, patiently at someone who might be listening. Is anyone out there? We have been trying to reach you for 200 years. I had been a patrol officer, a cadet, technically a person trained to watch and report and wait for someone else to decide, and I had made a decision in the back of a conference room while a meeting I was not supposed to be at was temporarily suspended based on a log I had read in one sitting and a conversation with a woman who had shown me with complete clarity and no drama at all what the stakes were. I had not saved anyone. The humans had not needed saving. They had spent 400 years ensuring they would not need saving, building everything they needed to not need saving so carefully and so completely that when the moment came, the worst thing that happened was 11 months of procedural argument. What I had done was choose in a small specific way which died of a very old story I wanted to be on, and that choice had been, as far as I could tell, the most important thing I had ever done, not because it changed the outcome. Mayan had prepared for every outcome, but because It was mine because I had read the record and understood it and decided that understanding it meant something. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same stars that had always been there. Inside the quarantine for 400 years, humanity had looked up at them from below a ceiling they could have broken through at any point and had chosen instead to do the slow, hard, unglamorous work of making sure that when they finally came through, they came through right. The transit vessel passed through the coordinates where the northern perimeter buoys had been. They were gone now, collected, studied, delivered as evidence. The space where the quarantine had been was just space. I drank my tea and read my list and arrived 9 hours later in orbit around a blue-green planet that the galaxy had spent 4 centuries ignoring. Dr. Ashat met me at the landing facility. She was shorter than I remembered and more tired looking, and she had the expression of someone who had finished a very long piece of work and was already thinking about the next one. She shook my hand, which was a human greeting gesture I had read about and which felt in the moment exactly as direct and uncomplicated as she was. How was the trip? She asked. Good, I said. I finished the reading list, all of it. You included 12 books. I know. I always send 12. Most people finish 4 or 5. She was already walking, and I fell into step beside her. Did you have the tea? And I thought about the card she had sent. I thought about Drell Vast's hand resting on the data core. I thought about a signal aimed at my station from 200 years of trying better than I thought it would be. I said. She smiled. It was the first time I had seen her smile, and it was the smile of someone who had been right about something for a very long time and was only now allowing themselves to enjoy it. Come on, she said. There's a lot to show you. We walked out into the morning of a planet that had been called dangerous, unpredictable, a thing to be contained and feared and left alone in the dark. The sun was warm. The sky was the particular color of blue that I had seen in photographs, but which was different in person, richer somehow, more present. Around us, people moved through the facility with the normal business of a civilization going about its day. They did not look at me. They were used, I suppose, to visitors now. They were used, perhaps, to being part of the galaxy instead of apart from it. I had filed my last report as a cadet 6 months ago. My first report as a liaison had described in careful professional language the events of the opening and the establishment of the new council framework and the formal retirement of the old quarantine protocol. It had ended with a personal note which was not standard practice but which my supervisors had allowed to stand. It said the rule, as I understood it when I was posted to monitoring, was a warning about danger. It was not. It was a warning about shame. The law existed not because humanity was dangerous, but because the truth about why the quarantine existed was dangerous. Dangerous to the people who had built it and the story they had told about it. The humans knew this. They had known it for nearly a century. They built everything they needed, documented everything that needed documenting, and then they waited, not because they were afraid of us, because they were ready to do this right. I had deleted the last line, but I thought about it now. Walking beside Myron through the morning, they had been ready to do this right, and they had. The old law was gone. The buoys were down. Quarantine was history, and above every monitoring station still operating at the edge of the revised patrol boundary. A new principle was encoded into the operating charter, not a warning about danger, not a rule passed from species to species like folklore teaching fear. Just a truth that someone had earned the hard way and written plainly for anyone patient enough to read it. Never assume a species is asleep just because it is. Quiet, Mayan stopped walking and pointed up at the sky. On a clear day, she said, you can see the transit lanes from here. The new ones. I looked up for a long moment. I saw only the blue, and then I saw them, thin, bright lines moving across the dome of the sky, unhurried. Precise, the tracks of vessels coming in, going through the space above a planet that was no longer alone. How many? I asked. Mayan tilted her head slightly. Counting today, she said. 43, but it changes every day. She said it the way you said something you had waited a long time to be able to say quietly, without drama. The way someone said a thing they had earned. We stood there for a while watching the sky,